Hello everybody and welcome to another video by yours truly, Brian the Pirate. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the things I love, the things that I don't love quite so much, and some of the things that I think are just inevitably going to change based on community sentiment, both in my communities and in the communities of fellow Path of Exile Andes. Technically, this is the second or arguably the first part of a two-part video thing that I'm doing. I posted the other part yesterday, so if you want to see that, that is in the description below. It's also going to be at the end of this video in the end card thing, where I talk about specifically the rare monster system, because it's a system I'm not particularly fond of at the moment. And I think it's just a bigger conversation. It's about a 10-minute video just about that system. So go check that out, as I think it's one of the bigger changes I would love to see made in Path of Exile. I think the current rare monster system is more a point of frustration rather than a challenge. And I just think it's something that could use improvements overall, because it seems to feel very Path of Exile 1-ish, especially when you think about the arch nemesis system. But like I said, go watch that video if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that. For now, let's talk about the things I like. Honestly, there's quite a lot that I like about Path of Exile 2. I like the new engine, or the updates to the engine, I suppose is more accurate to say. I love how beautiful the scenery is. I love how everything is like laid out, the feel of the combat and the updates to the combat. Melee has a lot more momentum to it now. I like how everything is a lot more engaging when it comes to the combat, more methodical, and you actually have to think for the most part about things, other than when it comes to rare monsters, of course. And I'm very, very much digging the aesthetic and the updates to the lore. Path of Exile 1 was very, well, let's just throw stuff at the wall and hobble stuff together. In the end game, the lore became a lot more cohesive and it started to make a lot more sense, whereas you could tell with the campaign, especially in Path of Exile 1, it was just kind of like, I don't know, we're not writers, let's just make some shit up kind of thing, as it like got produced over time. Whereas in Path of Exile 2, it's a lot more cohesive. Although I do have to ask, Sin, stop making monsters. How many of those seeds of the beast have you got? Do you have a back room somewhere and you're like, don't go in there, and it's just shelves of these seeds of the beast, and you're like, I can't stop making them, bad things keep happening, and yet I just keep making more? Stop it, Sin, behave yourself. I love the new animations and the effects for the skills that we've got. Everything is a lot more beautiful, a lot more brighter. Clarity is still a bit of a point of contention, but that's mostly because of it's a symptom more than an actual fault, I would say. And the symptom is we have the means to make such bombastic and crazy skills that it results in poor clarity, because you're covering the screen in either a million projectiles or a million other effects, or several attacks at once, because you've got cast on X and stuff like that happening at the same time. So I feel like the fix for the clarity would be basically preventing all of those things that we like about the game in the first place. It's a very, very difficult thing for GGG to juggle, because it's either you have the means to have so many abilities cast at once reduced, or you make the animations look kind of dull and boring. So it's going to be a tough problem for them to solve. But otherwise, in a vacuum, let's say, or when I'm especially having a single player experience and I'm not covering the screen in effects, I think it all looks and sounds, especially like the lightning attacks. Oh, the sounds are so good in Path of Exile 2. Likewise, that leads me on to like the atmosphere, the music. A lot of it's memorable. When I go into like a boss fight, I want to listen to the boss music, whereas in, say, other recent action RPGs that shall be named, I don't remember a single track from their soundtrack. That's not the case with Path of Exile 2. I quite like it's memorable. It's got a Path of Exile flavor to it. One of my favorite things about Path of Exile 2 is the boss fight. And I'm sure that's no surprise. I imagine that's probably the case for the vast majority of you watching. But the boss fights are just so well done. Apart from one boss, the Act 2 final boss can get fucked. I've spoken to a number of people about that boss, and this is an opinion that's coming from somewhere where I'm not assuming you're playing an overpowered build where you just nuke the boss before it has time to do anything. This is an opinion coming from the one who's anticipating loads of nerfs to slow down the game, so you have to actually see and go through the mechanics. I love the boss fights in Path of Exile 2 because they are skill-based. You have to dodge attacks. It's not just random spells and stuff that just happen whenever. It's actual things where you have to be mindful of what you're doing, where you are, encountering those like issues or things that happen as and when they do happen. The final boss in Act 2, however, I'm not a fan. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of his attacks, in contrast to literally what I just said, seem to be RNG. He has a lot of area denial based abilities, and you can do the fight once and only see a couple of them, not because you got through the fight quick, but simply because RNG just didn't make him cast those abilities. And then there'll be another time when you'll do the fight where he'll overlap loads of the area denial attacks. So the tornadoes, the portals firing all the things, the lightning coming down, the orbs that travel across the screen, all at the same time, which usually leads to one of two things. You either have no room to do anything and probably die, or you're just simply not able to attack him because all of the area on or around him has been denied by these abilities. So you spend sometimes a good 30 seconds, which in a fight in Path of Exile 2, 30 seconds is a long time. You just spend running around waiting for some of these abilities that the bosses cast to wear off, so you can go, oh, finally I can attack you now. And I think that's very, very much a problem for pretty much any build, but especially like two-handed melee builds, like mace builds. Maybe not quarterstaff users, because quarterstaff can be quite fast, of course, but like if you're a two-handed melee like weapon user, like axes in the future, probably swords as well, and currently maces, those wind up times for those attacks, you're going to feel them on that boss for sure. And no one wants to have that much downtime when fighting a boss, especially when it results in like your freeze or your electrocute or your stun bars or buffs just degrading, and you're like, cool, all that like stun that I built up over time has just disappeared. Likewise, when he temporarily goes invulnerable to like cut off the arse end of the dreadnought, he becomes invulnerable, so the stun bar starts going down. You go through like the little cinematic or the cutscene, let's say, and then you wake up and again, like all the freeze or electrocute you built up or the stun has disappeared, and it feels like he's starting from scratch, and it's just not a nice feeling. I'm not saying that they need to completely redo the fight, of course. I just think that they could probably add some countermeasures in that, one, if you're going through that cutscene, anything that you've built up over time, freeze, etc., stays at the number that it is, and maybe so that you can only do so many area denial abilities at once, rather than risking RNG doing all of them and then you just going, well, I guess I'll just shit in my hands and clap then. But outside of that one fight, I'm actually a really big fan of just the boss designs, the boss mechanics. Some of them are a little buggy, but I think they're going to obviously get fixed prior to 1.0 coming out. Like the again in Act 2, the Titan or / Colossus in the is it the Grave of the Titans or something like that. Very, very buggy fight, especially when it comes to targeting. Outside of those minor things that could be fixed, though, the boss fights in Path of Exile 2, especially when in comparison to basically all action RPGs that have come before it, including Path of Exile 1, they're just so fun to engage with. Now let's talk about some things that I think could use some improvements. Maybe things that are very likely to change as well. And first and foremost, I love the new Atlas system. I do really, really enjoy this idea of actually having to explore an atlas rather than just a web of map. At least to me, it just feels a little bit more engaging. There are a lot of tweaks that I would make to it though, namely the tower system. I think it's pretty widely agreed that the towers are a bit of a chore. They're a bit bothersome. I actually really like the idea of towers and having to put like the precursor tablets to buff certain areas, and that giving you a little bit of customization but not too much control, so you can just over buff the crap out of things. But the act of actually having to clear the tower zone is basically mandatory, and when something is mandatory, it automatically becomes a chore, and therefore you have to go to greater lengths to make people feel the fun, if that makes sense. And currently with the tower system, you go through a zone that's for very specific classes, it can be, or builds, it can be quite fun. Like my Deadeye build loves going into the tower zones, but for the vast majority of builds, I think the zone itself and the zone design is just a very unpleasant experience. And then, of course, because you think it's a chore, you just want to get through it as fast as possible. So you end up just throwing in a tier 1 tablet to get to the end of it, ignoring most of the monsters, just so you have the means to use it to buff the maps around the tower in the first place. A change I would personally make, and maybe you can give your thoughts on what you think of this in the comments below. I think they should do something similar to what they've done in, well, maybe Act 1 with the mana, the Count's mana. The last zone is actually several floors of the mana, or if you've played Path of Exile 1, you could do it something similar to like the Scepter of God or the prison tower, where you've got something that's in the shape of a tower, but it's multiple floors, but one zone, so there's not long loading screens. You just go from one instance to the next. And then the top floor, there could be a dedicated boss. Not a boss that is like map bosses, but something that's between rares and unique bosses. Maybe if you're familiar with Last Epoch, something similar to, I believe it's called Oribus. It's been a few months since I played Last Epoch, where the boss is always the same but different. So a different color will lead to having different abilities. So say there's a red version of this mini tower boss, and it has fire abilities, and there's a blue one that has lightning abilities, and you don't know what version you're going to get until you get to the top floor of the tower. The reason I think that should be a thing is, one, it will be a better format because you can have more open areas and more, which are just more fun to do, but also because there's just that little bit of a carrot on the stick on that last floor, that you know there is a boss that will give you relatively decent loot, so you're going to be more inclined to spend waste stones that are actually worth using as opposed to just dumping your tier 1s and tier 2s, but not so rewarding that you basically only do towers and they end up being the best thing to do. So as I said, maybe a new boss could be made that has different iterations, and it's not quite as good as drops as in comparison to regular map bosses, but it's not as bad as a rare and its potential to drop loot. I really like the new Atlas system as well. I love that you now have like dedicated trees rather than having to network your way to certain areas of the Atlas tree like you did in PoE 1. I would like to see it expanded though, and I imagine over time as new leagues and things get introduced, we will get more around the main tree, for lack of a better phrase, but I would especially like to see the main tree to be expanded on. I think it's a bit vanilla at the moment. Ooh, I've got a trade. Bear with me. Sorry about that. I should probably go into D&D, but at the same time, I like currency. But speaking of currency, I want to see the tree be expanded on, as I said. But there's this node here, local knowledge. It's a very powerful node. It's mandatory because it's so powerful, however. And that also leads me on to the fact that Magic Find works with currency. So one, I'm not sure how I feel about local knowledge. I feel like if you aren't using it, you're letting yourself down. Basically, it feels like it would be stupid not to use it because of how powerful of a node it is. It also means that you probably spend a lot of your time focusing on swamps, water maps, and the grass for socketable currency. Yes. So you're probably specifically focusing on those maps and potentially ignoring some of the others because of that. And it's a tricky one because I like that this node exists because it gives you more customization. And that's what Path of Exile is all about, having the control to do the content that you want to do. So I like that. But at the same time, I'm not sure if I would just prefer if they got rid of that node and then just slightly buffed the overall drop rate of everything in maps. What do you guys think? Would you rather just have drops overall be better on all maps, or would you prefer that you can select this node, albeit mandatory? If anything, actually, no, you know what? The third option, this isn't a node, this is just how maps work. Maybe that would be better, and I don't feel like I have to just select it. It's just how maps work, and that's a bit more in the middle of the two options. I'd probably, now I'm thinking about it, think that that is the way to go. But let me know what you think. Do you guys think that it would be better to just get rid of that node and just have that be how maps work, that swamps and water biomes are just better for currency, for example? Or would you prefer that they got rid of the node altogether and they just buffed all maps to have better drops overall? And as I mentioned, whilst we're on the subject of currency, it's monumentally stupid that currency is affected by rarity on items. It's made rarity on items pretty much mandatory. Not so much if you're playing solo self-found. I guess, but if you want to keep up with the economy in trade, you absolutely need to be using rarity on your gear, which means that you can't go all out with just making your, your builds juiced. And it also then pigeonholes people towards builds that facilitate having as much power as possible whilst also being able to easily fit in rarity. So it's made build diversity significantly less expansive than it could be. Now, there is an argument to be made that you should just probably remove rarity from the game altogether. I have seen those arguments. I do actually like the idea of magic find, but only if it affects items. I do like the idea, and Jonathan has mentioned this in previous interviews, that he likes that you can have this other axis to make builds around, that you have to sacrifice power in order to be able to, well, not have to, but you've got the option to sacrifice power in order to get potentially more or better drops. And that in itself is another problem to solve when making builds. But currently, because it affects currency, it is too... I've got another trade. Why is it when I'm streaming, my trades never come through, and then when I'm recording a video, all of them come through? Anyway, I digress. So I like that there is this option to try and facilitate it into builds, and it gives you another problem to solve. But that's coming from someone who likes making up their own builds. And I do think there is a place for magic find or rarity increases on gear to be in the game. It just absolutely under no circumstances should be affecting currency, and it blows my mind that GGG didn't see that coming. And I think this is one of the changes where they are inevitably going to remove it, because it pretty much seems universally hated by the community at this point. So I think that one's a pretty safe bet. Another thing that I think is very likely going to change, and I at least would very much like to see it change, is the socketing system. It's supposed to be a replacement for the crafting bench, and Jonathan himself has said that the idea is it's something that allows you a little bit of customization to plug up the holes in your build. The problem is, and I'm not dunking on either Jonathan or the devs, I just don't think they've experienced how impactful that is when it comes to endgame. As you can see here, I have a helmet that I haven't socketed yet, and haven't for many hours, because I don't want to put something in it that tops up my lightning resistance, for example, because eventually I intend on fixing my lightning resistance through the modifiers on my gear, and I would much rather have a chaos resistance soul core in that socket instead. So you end up running around with empty sockets, or on the other side of the spectrum, you end up putting something into a socket, and then that kind of hard locks that item where it's got lightning resistance, and then later on you find a really cool pair of boots that also have lightning resistance, but then you don't equip them because you don't need more lightning resistance, you need more fire resistance instead. Whereas if you were able to replace the socket in the helm, I could then go, okay, well, I no longer need it on the helm because I have it on the boots, so I'll put Chaos Res or something else in the helm, fire resistance, whatever, which will enable me to now use this otherwise great upgrade on my boots. Now, the change I specifically would make with this is I would want the sockets to be replaceable. So you put something in the socket, you can then put something that overrides it, destroying the original item. That also then provides a sync for those items, rather than being able to take things out. That allows the player to have the customization that they need for their build. And it also means, as I said, there's a bit of an item sync for soul cores, which can also make the chase for runes and soul cores a little bit more valuable in the first place as well. Another thing that I would potentially change, and to be fair, this particular thing, my opinion could change depending on another system that I'll come to in a moment. But the game is supposed to be slower paced than Path of Exile 1. The combat is supposed to be a lot more deliberate, and that means that a lot of the attacks have built-in hard caps when it comes to attack speed, rather. Mostly, again, melee attacks, like there's the quarterstaff attack, the zoomy one, which I actually really want to make a build with, but because it has that 0.8 second base attack time in it, I've been put off by that. A lot of the mace skills, like leap slam, have a minimum time that you can't surpass with attack speed and things like that. All of these things mean that the speed of the player combat, for the most part, is quite deliberate and slow, and yet monsters can swarm you almost immediately. Obviously, if you've been doing things like Breach or Ritual, you'll particularly notice this, but sometimes you can just run into an area and a map and you become immediately surrounded, and then you are body blocked, which depending on the build that you're playing, like if you don't have a lot of armor, for example, which a lot of people don't at the moment because armor's a bit pants, that means death. Now, I do think the changes to dodge roll have helped alleviate this problem a little bit, where they've set the size to 1 or whatever it was that they said. But there are still times where I get body blocked where it feels like I shouldn't be body blocked. And it's especially made worse by something else that I've decided I'm not really a fan of this. And that's like the pushing system. It feels awful. It feels buggy. There's been so many times where I'm in an attack and then I get pushed out of position, making me miss the attack or just completely whiff what I was doing. And not only is that a point of frustration, it just visually looks bad because you're being moonwalked backwards by some giant beetle and going Shamon or whatever, and it's just like, why? And it can also be very jarring at times as well. The camera can just, for lack of a better phrase, lose its shit, and it just looks like it's going out of sync, or it feels laggy. It's just not a system I like at all. Maybe they could make it feel better. Maybe they could get the camera to feel less jarring when those things happen. But I don't think they'll ever be able to alleviate the frustration of you being in the middle of some kind of attack and then you get moved out of position, and that then makes you miss any of the attacks, or being pushed into a corner or a place that you don't want to be in, all because there's lots of these little tiny beetles or other units just around you. I think the TLDR is, if anything, I don't like losing control of my character. I don't mind when I get hard CC'd or something like that, because those are things that I can, through gear, counter. But when something is able to just push me around and move me into places I don't want to be in, that is taking control away from me that I have no means to counter, and therefore it is just a frustration. Now, I mentioned that my opinion on some of what I've just been discussing could change a little bit, and that's based on the mapping system, and more specifically the fact that if you die once, you lose the map. The punishment for one death on one map, and especially on bossing as well, when you're doing pinnacle bosses, is just far, far too much. Not only do you lose the Waystone, which I would say fair play if you failed a map, but you also lose experience, you lose any modifiers that the map inherently had, such as bosses, events, etc., but also any modifiers added by the tower, despite the fact that it's still in range of the tower. They all disappear. So for just one mistake, which sometimes isn't your fault, it's literally because of RNG or the weird pushing mechanics or something, again, that's out of your control, that feels incredibly frustrating. And I've ruminated on this for a while, because Jonathan has said in the past that players are very good at identifying problems but not very good at coming up with solutions. And I've tried to think of solutions, and initially I thought, well, if there's a boss, reset the boss. Let us have multiple portals. Maybe not 6, but maybe 3. You can die 3 times on a map. But then I thought there's going to be a lot of trickery that they're going to have to do, because the boss will need to reset, but then not the events and things like that. And it might just be a little bit complicated. I'm not a developer, but potentially I feel like that would be the ideal scenario, that the rest of the map doesn't reset or update, but if there's a boss on the map and you've been fighting that boss, they go back to full health, and then you have 2 more attempts before you fail it. I feel like that would be my ideal solution, but I'm not sure if that would work. There is a solution. I'm not 100% sure what it is, but 1 death per map is just not it. It can't be it, and I'm quite certain a change of some sort is going to be made there. Probably loads of smaller changes that will eventually lead to them not having it be 1 death per map. And the reason I say that is because I think they're scared of making too drastic a change, because when you make a big change and the players love it and it ends up being overpowered, it's very, very difficult to then pull that back so it's not overpowered. So I think they're going to be erring on the side of caution. Another part of that I also kind of don't like is the whole, I talk about this in the rare monster video, you have to kill all the rare monsters to complete a map. Now currently you run the risk of running into a rare monster that is just unkillable depending on the build that you're playing. You can just, through this, like the power of RNG, come across a boss that's just impossible to kill. Sorry, come across a rare that is just impossible to kill and hard counters your build, which means you then have to abandon the map. I feel like there should be a different way to complete the map. A lot of people have thrown the idea out there that they should just have a boss on every map and then that should be the map completion. I'm not 100% sure I agree with that. I wouldn't be against it, but I also quite like the idea that bosses aren't on every map, and it means that I have the decision to make a build that focuses on map clear rather than bossing and things like that. Again, I like having options, and I like the idea that you can customize your build to facilitate those specific options, which I think is what GGG are going for. But potentially in the long run, it's probably going to be the easiest solution to the problems that people are having with both the fact that you currently can only have one death, and two, you have to complete the map by killing all the rares, which sometimes just isn't possible. I think the final thing I want to touch on is the unique items in the game. Obviously, this is early access. We don't have all of the base items yet, and thus, as far as I'm aware, we don't have all of the unique items. From my understanding, and this is mostly an educated guess, obviously we've got the Act 1 to 3 bases, and then we get Advanced and Expert, and I think they're placeholders for when we get the Act 4 to 6 base items, and those will disappear. And subsequently, with these new bases, we'll get a bunch of new uniques as well. So at the moment, we've only got the 1 to 3 uniques and then the boss specific uniques. But the current unique items that are in the game, a vast majority of them are kind of lackluster. As a build crafter, I tend to find a unique item and use that as inspiration for coming up with a build. There are some that definitely enable ideas and builds and have inspired me to come up with some builds even now, but the pool of items that actually do that are very small. A lot of the items that have potential to do that just don't have enough positives to counteract the negatives. Like, there's a few items where you're like, ooh, that unique effect is really cool, but it only gives me 30 life, and I'd be better off with a rare item that gives me 120 or 170 life, etc. So I think overall, unique items could use a bit of a buff. There's a lot of trash unique items. Slightly adjacent to that, I think skills are a little bit too limited as well. Like, off the top of my head, I think it's kind of weird that you can only use a mace specifically with a lot of the slam skills. I think it would be fair to have like quarterstaff be enabled with slam skills, or the other two-handed weapons be enabled with slam skills. Likewise, I think it's kind of weird that the ballista totem and the ripwire totem can only be used with crossbows when normal bows should be able to facilitate those as well. So yeah, just opening up skills to have more base types be used with them, I think will help a lot with build variety. It's something we see already in Path of Exile 1, so I'm not sure why they felt the need to limit it as much as they have in Path of Exile 2. So I'd love to see that get opened up. Base types in general, I think, could use a little bit of work. There's two types of items in particular. Three, technically, I suppose. One of them is boots. Movement speed is king in this game, and if you don't have movement speed on your boots, you're basically gimping yourself. It's a big disadvantage, especially with how fast mobs in the game currently are. The only time you would not have movement speed on your boots currently is pretty much because you found a unique item that has a very specific effect that is far more valuable to you or build enabling to you over movement speed. However, those situations are very few and far between, which basically means if your boots do not have movement speed on them, they are trash. So my solution to this would be to add a movement speed implicit to a number of pairs of boots. However, it would be a small amount. So large enough, not just like 5%, but maybe 10 or even 15%. So it's large enough to have a meaningful impact on your movement, but not so large that it becomes the go-to best in slot implicit or base type. Because if it was 20, 25, 30, and so on, everyone's just going to ignore all the other base types and only go for those ones. Whereas if it's 10 or 15%, you could then add other implicits to boots that can be competitive, like movement speed can't be reduced below X amount, or 50% ailment threshold, things like that, like chance to be frozen. Things that are thematic with movement, but can be competitive with that small amount of additional movement speed. And then that way, if you found one of the other implicits, you could then go, that's a valuable implicit. I can make up for the movement speed by trying to get a higher modifier on the boots. Alternatively, you could go, do I actually need 35 movement speed? No, because I've got 10 on the implicit. I can maybe do without any potentially to get a different modifier on the boots instead. The other base type is belts. I think it's really, really weird that you can only get charm slots via the passive skill tree or through modifiers on the item. And the reason I think that's weird, in particular with the modifiers, is a lot of the charms, which I suppose is the third item I have issue with, are temporary resistances. And I just sit there thinking, why would I want to take up a modifier on my belt to get a temporary resistance boost when I can just get the resistance boost as the modifier on the belt and it be permanent? And my solution to this would be to actually just add RNG to the charm slots. This Inferno clasp only has one charm slot. I find it's useful to me. I use it. I then find a second one that has 2 charm slots or 3. That provides an avenue of progression. It means that it doesn't just invalidate any 1 charm slots I have. They're still useful, especially if they're uniques because they have the effects that I need. But it also gives me that oh shit moment when I find a 2 slot or a 3 slot. It also means that it wouldn't invalidate the implicits either. Some people have suggested that it should be added as an implicit, but as like I said with the boots, it will be a case of everyone just gets the belts with those implicits and ignores the other base types. I think the charms could also be a little more interesting. Like I said, the only temporary resistance one I would consider using and have used is the chaos one. Otherwise, I just get the resistances elsewhere. And I feel like the only other charms that you're going to really use is the cannot be frozen and or stunned, and maybe the poison one, again, because you probably don't have the chaos resistance. Oh, and of course, the magic find one, because it applies to currency. I think we're going to wrap things up there, though. I've still got some ruminations that are bouncing around in my head, but this is early access and we've not really had a major patch yet. There could be other things that I could remark on, like some builds are unbalanced. I think over the next week or so, we're going to see a lot of balancing occur. I think it is needed by all means, but I'm not just going to call things out when there are, again, obvious changes that are going to be on the horizon. I look forward to seeing what GGG do over the next 6 or so months, and I'm quite confident for the most part that they're going to do the community proud. Yes, GGG have on occasion had slip-ups like with the arch nemesis system in the past and things like that. I think a lot of people are a bit hyperbolic when they're like, fun detected, nerf inbound. Like, some things are just obviously broken and need to be balanced. And I think something players need to also do is, if they can see the build that they've Googled is clearly imbalanced, that they should take it with a grain of salt and go, if I invest time into this build, it is likely to get changed during early access, especially where they're trying to make the game more balanced. I say this to my chat all the time. A lot of people are using Archmage at the moment, and I'm like, I'm glad you're having fun. Prepare yourself for changes that are probably going to happen and things like that. I just think that people need to be a lot more mindful that this game is in early access. There's going to be changes to the skill tree coming. There's going to be new gems coming. There's going to be new base types coming, new uniques. But the game in its current state, truthfully, outside of like the rare monster system and some of the minor things that can be tweaked, it's one of the best action RPGs I've played, if not the best. I have no doubt that when 1.0 hits, we will be looking at a historically amazing game. A game where in years down the line, we are going to be talking about Path of Exile 2 being the best in its genre. I am quite confident that we will speak of Path of Exile 2 in the same way many of us speak of Diablo 2, especially people who are new to the genre in this era. And I am, of course, just stoked to be here to see it. So that's going to be it from me. If you liked this video, do please give it an actual like. That helps with the algorithm gods. Maybe subscribe and hit the bell if you're not already. I stream on Twitch, twitch.tv/Brian the Pirate. I also have a Discord server filled with many fellow Path of Exile Andes. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is the second video where I specifically talk about the rare monster system. Would love it if you check that one out. I think it's a really interesting discussion. The link to that is in the video description and probably appearing on screen around about now. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Farewell. I'll remember you.